Hi everybody, it's Dr. Nichols-Boyle, and today I'm going to talk to you about Irish history. So this is going to be a little long because we're going to try to do 300 years in maybe about 40 minutes. I'm going to break this into two parts, 20 minutes about on the first half of Ireland or the early days where we're going through from the late 1600s through the Act of Union in 1800 and seeing this is a lot of the time period that influences the readings that we have been doing so far in those 19th century readings, and then breaking it up after the Act of Union through independence, which happened in 1921. So the way that I like to understand history, and we'll see how it influences the literature and the other things at the time and how they kind of helped form the identity together, but really to think of it as a story. So we have to kind of see how these different events are connecting over time and how they influence each other, and not just what's happening in Ireland, but what's happening in England, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere in the world, and how these kinds of events impacted each other and had the knock-on effects for the next major part of Ireland, and how this helped form their identity and culture in many ways. So as we go through, I'm going to maybe pause a few times to kind of help you think about it, or ask you to pause and ask you a question, so it tries to be a little more interactive and showing you some images and things along the way to help you get a better idea as well. And of course, this will all be helping with the history quiz that we'll be having next week or the following. So anything that you need to know for this, you should look. Most of the materials that I'm using you can get here in the Irish History and Geography page, which is in this week's module. I pointed you already to the history of Ireland, late 18th century to 1921, which is kind of the main area we're focusing on. And then you can look up details there for things that you forget. I would highly recommend too that you print off this brief Irish history timeline. And I've highlighted the major things that you need to know and that I'm going to go over in more detail here throughout the lecture. And this will also help you as you study for the quiz. It will be open book, of course, because we're online, but it will be asking you more of the details about how it affected the Irish, or how it relates to maybe one of the readings, things like that. So you will need to have this extra information and be taking notes, as well as just sort of the dates and basic facts here as well. So it will really help to know those kinds of things. So let's get started. And we're going to start with a guy called Oliver Cromwell. So this is in the mid 1600s, and you can see we have to start somewhere, but there was an Irish rebellion before this in an English Civil War. The Irish took advantage of that Civil War to form their own rebellion and try to get back some of their land and fight against the Protestant immigrants who had come into the area, particularly in the north of Ireland. And there had been, on the Irish part, some murders of Protestant landowners, particularly, and things of that nature. So, in any event, Oliver Cromwell was a military man, and he was sent over to put down the Irish. So basically, they said, we don't want you to just, and this is England's ruling is in kind of chaos as well. So they don't want Oliver Cromwell to just come over and stop things. They want him to send a message, and so that this doesn't happen again. So there's a place called Drogheda, which is outside of Dublin, and there's one of the big events of when Oliver Cromwell comes over with a huge British force, around say 1,000 to 3,000 troops, and he comes to the massacre of Drogheda. Well, not the massacre then, Drogheda, and this is where some of the rebels had kind of geared together. There was a small militia, but generally they were obviously outmanned, outgunned, and they didn't have too much protection overall. So Cromwell puts this down in style. He not only gets kills all of the militia, but he and his soldiers murdering practically the entire town. So they end up killing in general. The figures kind of vary, but around 3,000 people, and this includes civilians. This included women and children. This included priests. So many of the people, sometimes people had barricaded themselves inside a church for protection, and Cromwell burned down the church. And then if people tried to escape, he and his soldiers would take the bayonets through the pointy parts at the end of a rifle and spike them and push them back into the fire. And afterwards, sometimes people's heads were put on stakes as an example. And this was something similar happened in Wexford. So there was very little resistance after this, and they achieved what they wanted to. But Cromwell's name and this attitude was not forgotten. And even today, if you say somebody a horrible insult, and you'll see it maybe sometimes in some of Carleton's work, I'm not sure what we're reading this time, calling someone Cromwellian is the ultimate insult. So without mercy, horrible, cruel behavior. And after they took over this area, then they sent many of the Irish who were living there to the part of Ireland in the northwest called Connacht, Connaught, and the expression became to hell or to Connacht. So Connacht was such a poor place in terms of land and barrenness that there wasn't anything else there. So that would be part of the worst place that you could go to. So they took their land, claimed it as their own, and then sent them off, much like reservations, if you want to think about the American kind of equivalent. And actually, my husband always hates that expression because he's from Connacht, or that area of the country. He's from a little town called, about maybe a little bigger, but somewhere between 2,500, 4,000 people, called Carrick-on-Shannon, on the River Shannon in County Leitrim. So he particularly hates that. It's obviously gotten better, but at the time, that was one of the huge ways of thinking about it. So everything in history has a cause and effect, right? So after Cromwell's invasion, the Massacre of Drogheda, then we move on to other events happening in England. So eventually, one of the new rulers, the next major important event, and again, it's not important necessarily that you know these exact dates, although you'll have access to this during the exam, but just kind of how these affected each other and these major names and who they were. So James II is crowned King of England, and you'll notice it says here that he's Catholic. So this is important because when we think of the English, we think Protestant, but this wasn't always the case. And there's a longer history there, but in general, James II converts to Catholicism. This is a major problem for many people because they feel like, especially the leadership in England, that all of a sudden Catholics will maybe get preference and they'll get special rights. It might be more sympathetic to Ireland or other places that have a strong Catholic population. So they're not happy about this. And remembering at the time, there's always a lot of back and forth and fighting over rulership. So you have William of Orange, who was a Protestant. He's also married to Mary. So if you've heard of the college William and Mary, that's where this comes from. And he had some claim to the throne through his heritage and through his wife. And Mary, who he's married to, is James II's daughter. So there's a kind of a double claim to the throne here. And he's called William of Orange not because he always wore orange or because he looked orange, but because he had land and had rulership in Holland, whose national color is orange. So that's why he's called William of Orange. So he gets some backing. He invades England to overthrow James II. James II flees to Ireland, where he knows he's going to have more support because of the Catholics, right? And there's a couple of battles there. This is something we'll go into a little bit more when we get into modern Ireland because some of these still have effect now. But essentially, he loses there at the Battle of the Boyne after a big siege in Derry, or Londonderry, depending on your persuasion. Catholics call it Derry. The Protestants call it Londonderry. It's in the north of Ireland. We'll see some pictures of that later. So James II loses. So now the Catholic king is out. Protestant king is back in. And again, they want to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. So this brings in, under William of Orange and William and Mary, as King of England, a period of severe laws against Catholics, and these are called the penal laws. So this is the late part of the 17th century, early part of the 18th century. And these are the kind of laws that Carleton would have grown up under, although they eased over time. So this is a period of the most severe ones of those laws. They had acts, and you don't need to know when each of these was passed, but these kinds of things that they did. They restricted the rights of Catholic to education. We talked about that a little bit before. They couldn't bear arms or have weapons. They couldn't possess a horse worth more than £5, which is not very much money. Pounds is a monetary figure. You can think of it kind of like dollars or something. The Catholic clergy are banished, so they're no longer allowed to have Catholic priests. You had to go to France or somewhere else in order to be a priest and had to practice in secret. Catholics cannot buy land, and there's tests for holding public office. So tests, meaning that you had to prove that you were loyal to the crown, and the crown, the king or the queen, would have been the representative of the Church of England. So you're essentially swearing loyalty as well to another religion. So you cannot swear loyalty to that and still be Catholic, really. You'd have to convert in order to hold any public office to a different religion, to Protestantism, to the Church of England or Church of Ireland, and to be able to buy land. And at the end of this period of time, Catholics also lose the right to vote. And of course, it wasn't really secret voting anyway, but it still is something they did not want to have happen. And to give you a sense of sort of the range here of what this looked like between how the Catholics were living and how the Protestant landowners were living during this time period, you can see this here. I'm going to set this up a little bit bigger. This is Castletown House, which is around the 18th century. So you have these giant estates, and this would be an example of what the ruling family would be living in. One that's still around and you can visit today. This is not too far outside of Dublin. And not all of them would be this grand, but you'd have this giant house. They would call it a house, even though we would think of it more as kind of a manor or almost a castle. And this would be just for the family and their servants. And then all around it, on this land, they would own all this land, and some of it they would use themselves, but then the rest of it they would divide up into small little plots that the Irish Catholics, that the locals could rent back from them and pay them rent. They were also entitled to a percentage of whatever crop that they had, percentage of their animals they wanted to keep it. So it was very hard to get ahead. So they would be living in these small kind of thatch-roofed little cottages, many people to a small area of land, growing potatoes all around this huge, beautiful house. So that gives you some sense of what was going on at the time. All right, so then we have things starting to ease a little bit at the end of the 18th century. So you can see here, there's this legislation that has to reduce Irish grievances. So they granted the Irish Catholics some rights of leasing and inheritance. They're allowed to own some land and receive an education towards the end of this time. And it's worth thinking about why the sudden change of heart, right? So what is going on around that time period, the late 1700s, that would lead England to all of a sudden be kinder and grant some rights to the Irish and Irish Catholics? So you can pause here, write down your thoughts, think about it for a second. You're right, I'm assuming. It is thinking about what's happening in America particularly. This is when we were fighting the War of Independence, right? So much of England's troops were involved in fighting against American troops to try to protect that land very far away. So they don't want to have to be fighting a battle on two ends and with a reduced force of their own, right? So they don't want to have to be dealing with these Irish rebels. So let's try to keep them a little bit happy, maybe by giving them some rights. That will that will help it, although we'll still sort of be in control, right? And then you also have on the same side, they're getting worried because the French Revolution begins around the same time. And the French Revolution was more of a civil war, kind of going against their rulers. But both the American Revolution and the French Revolution had a great influence on Ireland. People knew about these things, and they were afraid it would inspire the Irish to revolt. Even though England is not really involved in the French Revolution, this is a fear. It's happening right next door, and they're worried that they're going to have to deal with this at the same time as dealing with other conflicts around the world. So you can see that they give the Irish some independence here at the end of the 1800s. So Irish parliamentary independence for about 20 years or so. They have the right to rule themselves to some degree. It was still limited. You could still only Anglo-Irish Protestants were allowed to hold office still. And often your landlord would know it was open ballot. You would know how you voted. If you didn't vote the way they wanted you to, then you could be pushed off. So there wasn't really a lot of representation. But it was still people who were living in the country and had some sense and of knowledge of your welfare and looking out for you, more so than people ruling you from abroad. So there was some independence, although the United Kingdom and England would still have had in Westminster, which is where their head of government was and is, would still have been making a lot of the bigger decisions, but they had some independence here. And then you get some of these major things. This is a big one to know, the Catholic Relief Act, which often gets confused with the Catholic Emancipation Act, we're going to talk about in a little bit, which allows Catholics to vote again. So they're allowed to vote for Parliament, but still can't serve in Parliament. So they can't be a government official themselves, but they're allowed to vote. And as I mentioned, this is still not a fantastic right because you don't really have the Secret Ballot Act yet, and you don't have a lot of options of who you're voting for, but still, they're allowed to vote now. They have some power back. And with this kind of inspiration from the other revolutions, we get to a big event that we're going to be talking about and reading about a little bit more later, called the 1798 Rebellion. And the name's in the title, happened in 1798. So the group that led this were called the United Irishmen. And their leader was a man called Wolfe Tone, who is famous in Irish history. And they even have a band called the Wolfe Tones, an old folk band that followed his lead. And they got some help from the French, but of course the French were sort of wrapping up their own revolution, and they weren't able to send too much, and they were able to get some support there, however. And Wolfe Tone was a Protestant, which might surprise you, but he believed that all of the people in Ireland should be allowed to have, regardless of religion, should be allowed to rule themselves and to have that separation from England. And he thought that he would be able to get the Catholics on side, which he did, and then as well the Presbyterians, which is also Protestant as well, but they were looked down upon by Church of England Protestants because they had split from them a little bit, and that they could rally behind getting rid of the British and making sure that Ireland had its own government, its own interests, its own nation. And this is a real time of nation building, as you can see with France, as you can see with America, this idea of separating yourself and making a distinct nation and culture for your own. So that's what's happening at the end of this. So the 1798 rebellion happened. As with all of the Irish rebellions until the very end, it failed. And it failed pretty miserably. It was a short rebellion, maybe lasted about 3 months. Wolfe Tone, we'll read more about it later, but just to give you kind of the highlights, Wolfe Tone had gone to France to try to recruit a force there to come back and take on the British. While he's gone recruiting, the people there that are on the side, the United Irishmen, are getting a little bit restless. So they decide, we're just going to go ahead and declare this and fight against the British that are around, and the British army comes over. And they were able to kind of last a while because they knew the land very well, kind of this guerrilla warfare, but they were greatly outmanned and outgunned. and had, they Catholics not allowed to own weapons, so they had to kind of smuggle everything in. They don't have the same kind of power, so they were although they had some victories, it was crushed pretty quickly. In the meantime, Wolfe Tone tries to land and come in, but is unable to. He has a small French force with him, because of weather. So it's bad weather. He has to leave and come back again. When he comes back, they are waiting for him. The British are waiting for him, and he's quickly taken into custody, and he hangs himself. And he says, "I would rather die by my own hand than by yours," basically. So he ends up being killed and a martyr and a hero for Ireland. But that is kind of the end of the 1798 rebellion. And some of the things the 1798 rebellion was known for, that we will be looking into more this semester, is the horrible treatment on the side of the British. There are some instances with the Irish as well, but not nearly as many, where the English would often torture people that they found, try to make an example of them. Instances of rape or killing women and children, priests, those kinds of things. So there's verifiable accounts. The extent of it is kind of up for debate, but it's also important to think about that this, somewhat like the American Civil War, many of the people in Ireland, it split up the country. So there were people who were Protestant but still consider themselves Irish. They might have had felt some connection to their English heritage, but there's kind of Anglo-Irish, but they lived there alongside and next to Catholics for their whole lives. And these people were empowered by the British Army to be yeomen or military, and like a militia. And all of a sudden they're turning on people, their neighbors, that they've known their whole lives. So it was incredibly hurtful in that way too for them. And the kinds of methods that were allowed legally and not allowed legally of torture were really interesting. So I'll show you a few pictures to kind of give you an idea of what's going on at this time, and then we'll get to the Act of Union and stop this section. So here's one. Pull this up a little bit. This is called picketing, and I think it will show it here. It's P-I-Q-U-E-T-I-N-G, picketing. And this is a method of interrogation that was allowed. So a picket is this kind of iron spike, and this would be the sort of thing that you would tie your horse to so that it wouldn't go away while you were in somewhere, right? And picketing was taking someone and on this pulley kind of system, tying their hand and their foot behind their back here, and then lowering them down onto this iron spike so that only their foot, so all the pressure is on that foot, right? And they're lowering them down and down and down, asking them questions, saying, I can stop whenever you want me to. And then they would pull them back up, give them some relief, and then do it all over again as they ask questions and try to get results. So this is one of the methods that was being used at the time, called picketing. There's another method that, again, was also legal, and this is called half hanging. So you have this method, and it wasn't always quite so complicated, but this kind of method where you hung a person by their neck, but they're able to stand on here, and not have that pressure if you have that contraption in the right position. But then you would roll it forward so they have no leverage, basically choking them to death. And then just as they're about to die, maybe you let up again, ask your question, say, okay, now you want to talk? Now who's in on this with you? Who did this? And then do it again. So this was the half hanging method, again, of interrogation that the British would often employ as well. And then here's one that was not necessarily legal, but that happened, and this is called pitch capping. So the Irish really admired, as I mentioned, the French. So the French here often had what they called the French croppies, the kind of haircut, this cropped haircut they had, because remember at the time, many of the upper class would wear wigs, those white wigs with the long ponytails and things like that, or powder their hair. So as they were fighting against the aristocracy, the upper class in France and saying we don't agree with their tactics and the way that they're punishing the working class and not allowing us to get ahead. So we're going to cut our hair off as kind of a protest. So they had the rebels in France had these short haircuts. So the Irish, some of the Irish, did this as well. And so the British took this kind of pitch capping and said, okay, you don't want hair anymore. You think that's such a big deal? Great, we'll help you with that. So they would take pitch or tar, hot tar, pitch, and they would kind of like tar, and they would put it inside a cap like you're seeing here, and then put it on the person's head while it's hot, so it's burning their scalp, and then wait for it to cool and harden, and then rip it off. And of course, much of your hair and scalp would come with it. And this was called pitch capping. And then they would call the Irish croppies because of that cropped haircut and the pitch capping involved. So this gives you a sense of some of the things that were going on here. And we'll be reading more about this later, but we were talking about a pretty high body count on the Irish side, very low on the English side, in terms of people dying. And again, a real turmoil in the country, a rebellion against the upper class living there, and then the British Army that came in to help. So that's 1798. And you'll notice that the Irish, so this is kind of the response to this is, well, this is what happens when you give them any power, right? So you try to give them some rights, try to trust them, and then they're going to rebel against you. So as a result, we get the Act of Union in 1800. So it happened, it was passed at the end of 1800, goes into effect in 1801. But 1800 is really much the date you would need to know. And this is just right before Robert Bell writes Document B, talking about the Irish. So this is kind of a big deal here too. And the Act of Union does two things that it's important to know about. One, it gets rid of the Irish Parliament. So there's no longer their own governing body at all. And they actually had to vote themselves out of it. And you might think, why would people do that? But we'll get into that. So the Act of Union reincorporates the Irish Parliament into the English Parliament. So now they're only being ruled from England from Westminster. And Ireland also becomes part of the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland later. But now it's just the United Kingdom, which is just all of Ireland, and it includes then Scotland and Wales and England. So they no longer have their own representation. There's a lot of talk about the Act of Union. We'll see some of this when we look at the 1798 readings in and around there. It was a way to get the Irish under control. But in other ways, it does seem odd that the people, the Anglo-Irish Protestants, voted themselves out of power. And they did this for a myriad of reasons, but one of the biggest was because of bribery. So they were promised more land, more money if they voted in a certain way. And Catholics voted, the majority of them voted for it too, which you might think seems even odder. But they were promised by the ruler at the time this idea that, well, if you vote for the Act of Union, then we will give you Catholic emancipation, or we will allow you to hold office, and at least you'll have some say, which is more than you have now. You're already subjugated in the condition that you're in. So if you vote for this, I mean, it won't be a threat because you'll still have only a minority power, but at least you'll have a voice. And I think I could get that done if you vote for the Act of Union. So they do. And in the end, the ones with the bribes still get them, I suppose. But the Catholics, of course, don't. And that Catholic emancipation does not happen. So that takes us through the first part. We'll stop there and then get into the second half.